Good afternoon, crazy quilters. We are ready to talk about embellishments. Can't believe that it is a month since we got together, but it is. Hopefully you've made more progress than I, but I am justifying my lack of completion on the fact that we're doing this to have fun. We don't have a deadline, we don't have a person in mind that we're gifting it to. We're just playing. And so to play, we play when we can, when the opportunity arises. That's what I've decided. Next time you're in the shop, if you have a spare minute, go to our little reading corner, and on the coffee table is this America's Glorious Quilts book, a huge encyclopedia, but its cover is a crazy quilt, and some beautiful, beautiful work is illustrated. And there is also an entire chapter dedicated to crazy quilts. So as I say, if you have a few spare minutes and have purchased all the fabric you need, take a quick look at this book, because it's just beautiful what some people do to embellish their crazy quilts. I think we had touched on this briefly during our first get-together. An embellishment can be absolutely anything. It can be a picture, a blue ribbon. It can be anything that you want to have part of your memorabilia, or if you're just thinking it will enhance the piece you're working on. So don't be limited to laces or rickrack or things that you can find that are used to embellish a garment or an item. Think outside the box, and what do you have that you might want to include? Another thing we need to be pretty sure of by this time, though, is how are we going to use our squares that we're working on? And by that I mean, are you just going to do maybe 4 of them for a wall hanging? Are you just doing it to wait and see how many you end up with, which will limit what you can do up front? I have decided for mine, I'm going to use sashing. I'm going to use probably black because of all the colors I have going. And I am only going to be quilting on this around each square. I'm not going to be quilting on the interior. If you're going to be quilting on the interior, then using buttons at this stage is not an option because you want a flat surface for your quilting, and of course buttons are going to get in the way. So think that through. I read in one publication where an individual used good size buttons at all of her intersections of her squares, and that's what secured her different layers, her sandwich that she had. That's an idea for buttons if you don't want to quilt it. It's sort of the knotting approach, only rather than using yarn, you're using a button at each intersection of 4 squares. So give that some thought, because if you're going to use buttons, as I have done here, then I am not going to easily be able to quilt this piece. And since I have this in my handy little hand, what my buttons here are doing are further enhancing a decorative stitch that I used. And I think you should be able to make that out. The stitch was fine, but I liked those buttons, and so I thought, well, that would be That would be pretty. And there's other decorative stitches on this particular square. Is it finished? I don't know yet. I don't know. But that is what I did there. You can do embroidery. And here is one where I have some embroidery. I am not an embroiderer, whatever the word is. And I now know I probably never will be. If you do embroidery by hand, God bless you, and go for it. You will have some beautiful work. But for me, the hand embroidery that I will be doing will be limited, and it's going to be very simple designs. And I am using a book that I had, and heaven only knows where I got it, but this is the book. Fortunately, it does have a lot of stitches in it, as you can imagine, but there is one whole section, and I'm going to show you this just sort of what your appetite is to what you can do. There's one whole section on crazy quilt combinations, and having done just a few stitches and realized how long it takes me to do those simple stitches, I can't conceive of the time some embroiderers will put into a stitch. I mean, they're absolutely gorgeous all by themselves. So you can get as involved as you want. But when it comes to embroidery, I have learned that my go-to stitch is the French knot. And a French knot can embellish all kinds of things. Let's pull one out. Here I have done just a simple little straight stitch embroidery, but it's a back, I think it's called the back stitch. And it's a very gentle zigzag. And then I use French knots just to accent each point. When you're doing embroidery, you're probably going to want to have some kind of a pencil. I prefer the air erasable, but there's also, and which we do carry, we also have pencils that have the eraser on them. There are pencils that are water soluble. I would caution you on those unless you are willing to dampen and then have to iron your square, but that's up to you. Because when you're doing things such as, well, let's look at this one instead. Here I did what's supposed to look like flowers. I needed to know my point. I wanted to be as true to the pattern, to the design as I could be. So I put little dots where my petals were going to be. Here I have these, well, X. And again, I used a ruler to determine where it was going to be, because maybe you don't have this issue. When I was doing it freehanded, I found that some were longer than others, some just, I don't know what direction I was going with them. So use a pencil as your guideline, especially when I'm down here are some X's, some crosses, and I really needed to know my limitations to stay within the space I wanted. So that's one way of embellishing. Sometimes I just use decorative stitches, like here. It's an excellent way of becoming familiar with your machine. Here we have some rickrack. Never having been a garment sewer, I do not have a lot of scrap trim. So it was just what I could find. I did find some nice little multicolored rickrack at Joann's and a little bit of lace. I mean, you really can use absolutely anything and everything. I have some tassels that are waiting for a spot to call their name, and then they will make themselves at home on that square. I haven't come up with a square yet for it. So my point being, whatever I will have a lot of buttons on my squares because I have buttons, and I only have buttons because it's something that when we have cousins camp with our grandchildren here in town, we always have a craft period during the day. And so I have over time collected a lot of buttons that they can use for whatever our project is. As I'm looking down here, here's a print, the fabric I used, and I used the French knots in the center just for a little embellishment. Make sure you are using a very sharp needle. It has to be a very sharp needle to smoothly go through your fabric. And especially if you are using a foundation piece, as most of us are doing, you need a sharp needle. I think I had mentioned this in class, but it would be wise to reiterate. If you are doing decorative stitches with your machine and chose not to use a foundation piece, use a stabilizer, because as you may have found out by now, those decorative stitches are a lot of stitches very close together or going every which way, and it wants to bunch up or crimp up your fabric. So do take the time to practice your decorative stitch on just some scrap fabric before you put it onto your square. Don't practice on your square, because if we think ripping out a seam is a lot of fun, try ripping out some of these decorative stitches. So make sure the stitch is going to work for you in the manner you want it to before you put it on your square. So I think that is about it. We probably won't be getting back together till we talk about how we're going to assemble it, what we're going to do with it. I've sort of mentioned what I'm planning on doing, but I think we're going to let a couple months go by, and maybe we'll just get back together, not necessarily with our machines, because that can get to be a little cumbersome, but just get back together to chat and, well, what problems have you had, what successes, just to touch base and give some hints to each other that we might have, and also some horror stories, I'm sure. So that's it, guys. Enjoy. I'm having fun with mine. How do you know when you're finished? Well, as soon as you think you're finished, I read in a book, you should add one more thing. I don't know about that. See what you think of that little rule of thumb. So that's it. Crazy quilters, go to town. Thanks. Bye now.